Welcome very much. It's all yours, Reyna.
Thank you so much. Wow, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to need to be able to share my screen in a minute because I have a little slideshow for you. But wow, that meditation was really helpful today. I totally agree. It's been a difficult year, difficult decade, maybe some would say. And today it's really an honor and a privilege to get to present to you what we've been doing. So I'm Reyna Lopez. I am the executive director of PCUN. It stands for Pineros y Campesinos Unidos del Noroeste. You may remember my predecessor, Ramon Ramirez, who has recently retired. And we were just on the phone last night. I let him know I was going to be here today. He says hello. And wow, it's been quite a year. As you know, I'm the first woman to lead this organization. The farm worker movement has its own history around gender justice that we're still reckoning with. And today's been one of those days where I've been a little emotional about it, to be honest. And you have my bio, but a little bit about me. I myself, I'm a daughter of immigrants who came to Oregon following the migration north of farm work. And my mother is from Hermosillo, Sonora, from the north. My dad's from Zamora, Michoacan. Um, Daughter of Purepecha indigenous folks of Michoacan. And basically in 85, we settled in Salem following the migration of the Christmas tree industry, the Pinos. And my father was also a member of PCUN in that time. So for me, this work is really full circle, really interconnected into my life in very weird ways. And I'm really happy to get to share with you some of the work that we've been doing this year, and grateful too for the topic of human rights, because this is something that has been a struggle for our farm worker movement. Some of you have likely been following the work since Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And what I wanted to talk to you about today was really around how the pandemic has and the recent wildfires have really magnified the gaps in our societies. Farm workers are being deemed as essential workers and yet are not treated as essential. But what I like to say to people is that we were essential before the pandemic, we're essential during the pandemic, and we will be essential afterwards. And time again, I've been hearing heartbreaking testimonies from our agricultural workers who, frankly, they feel forgotten. Why? Because today, 50% of workplace outbreaks in Oregon affect our essential food supply chain. Because today, 40% of COVID 19 cases are Latinx, despite us being only 12 to 13% of the population. Even though, one side note here, census is probably going to shift that quite a bit. So we're excited to see those results. And also the fact that Marion County, where PCUN is headquartered, is one of the places that has been hit the hardest by COVID 19, and also in the past month around the wildfires, because we're hearing that people are being fired for getting the virus or just not entitled to any kind of paid sick leave to be able to take the time to care for themselves, to quarantine, because we know that it's not a secret that these farm workers are a majority of our workers are undocumented, and it hasn't been acknowledged that we are the backbone of the workforce, and that our farm workers have been left behind on federal stimulus and unemployment insurance, no safety net. And because agricultural workers are being asked to work in some of the most dangerous conditions without that being reflected in their pay. And today we know that labor housing, having dozens of people in those spaces, makes social distancing absolutely just not possible, and the conditions in the housing deadly. And because we know people in small towns are literally dying to put food on our tables, and because we also know that children are doing distance learning out in agricultural districts and many times don't have access to Wi-Fi, things that we take for granted. So we're really trying to leverage this term essential worker to highlight the human rights aspect of this. I think this moment can really be a catalyst for change. And never before have we seen in the mainstream that our workers that have been exploited by the systems are being called essential. But this contradiction is still there. Our fundamental goal as PCUN has always been to end the exploitation of agricultural workers, and that has made our community very resilient. And even with this new term, essential, it seems like we're still disposable in many ways. But the community has really, I think, leaned in on this term, and I think that today we're still continuing to fight that struggle, right? A little bit too about early PCUN. This is really what prompted PCUN to start. These are labor conditions in a camp just behind the Woodburn Outlets, actually, in the early 90s. So really, this was the impetus. Workers that were pretty fed up with these conditions, that were very inspired by the work of Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, and it inspired 80 farm workers to start their own union, despite the fact that we don't actually have collective bargaining rights or protections under the National Labor Protections Act. It was a si se puede moment. We're going to do it. We're going to try to do it si se puede, right? Which is one of our essential central values. And even today, I will say that we've done so much, but there's still so much to do and such a long way to go. This is even a labor camp in the recent just recently that we got to go visit that still has pretty bad conditions. So we're still working through that. And as we know that our workers are still lacking protections and lacking action from our agencies, the same agencies that are supposed to protect us. And it's constantly an uphill battle there. When it comes to COVID, though, we've seen the outcomes really be pretty devastating for agricultural workers. There is a huge divide between low wage workers and higher income families and communities. I think that I wanted to run through some of the examples this past year of workplace outbreaks that have really affected people in a huge way. This is just one that happened actually in April 23rd of 2020, an early one in a meat packing plant. Some of you might have heard of the infamous Tyson, where a severe coronavirus outbreaks affected meat packing plant workers in Washington. And unfortunately, that disease claimed a life of a longtime plant worker, 60-year-old J. Guadalupe Olivera Mendoza, who went home ill in March and basically died that Monday afterwards in the hospital on a ventilator. And people ask me, so, what are some of the conditions that you think kind of led to that? Definitely the working conditions. People are literally working shoulder to shoulder. It's not easy to socially distance in a meat packing plant, if anyone's ever had to work in one. And we know that the virus spreads like wildfire. And when we have people like Guadalupe Olivera, who maybe don't have health insurance or are underinsured, or maybe just didn't have access to resources early on to get over the virus, this is the outcomes that we're seeing. There was also another early example that showed that tests of workers in central Washington orchards found that dozens were COVID-19 positive without even having symptoms. And this was actually an example of a company that was doing things right. They were testing, they were being very proactive. And even after that, just showing the how vicious this disease is, the company ended up having 71 workers that ended up testing that were tested, and 36 of those ended up being COVID-19 positive. And even just recently, this year, Oregon was in the New York Times for the alarming rates that we were seeing in our Latinx community on COVID-19. And it was really clear that it was disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Here in Oregon, there's about 87,000 farm workers, seasonal and migrant. And like I said, we know that's the backbone of the workforce, the essential food supply chain workforce. Without farm workers, we don't eat, and we still eat during a pandemic, right? So 40% also speak indigenous languages. Some of the top spoken include Zapoteco, Triqui, Mixteco Bajo, Mam, Chuj, and a number of our workers lack authorization, about 50 to 70%. And we know that Black and Brown people were hit the hardest by COVID-19, yet we're still very under resourced when it came to ensuring that folks had the care that they needed at the time. And we also really went into action around the COVID-19 stuff, because early on we were getting messages from people's GoFundMe's to fund families whose elders started to pass away from COVID-19. And so this was really something that brought it right into the forefront of all of our organizing work. And I'll share with you a little bit more after this slide, in a later slide, about what that is. We also had heard about the Townsend farm owner who spoke out about the clusters of virus and the cases there. We had actually heard from multiple Townsend farm workers, and that's based right here in our home, in our backyard in Oregon. There's actually a farm out in Multnomah County of, at this point, there's been dozens and dozens of cases, and we got to hear directly from a worker out in Townsend Farms that let us know that he was scared. He's been afraid, and there wasn't the protections or the precautions that were being put in place to be able to protect these workers, and that he said it very straight up in a conversation that we ended up having with Senator Merkley. You're calling me essential, but I don't feel essential. I don't feel like anyone cares about us. And this is what we're seeing in the farms. This is what we're hearing from politicians. Y'all need to do something about this. And then, of course, there was another outbreak that hit pretty close to home. This outbreak actually happened in a fruit packing company in Hood River. Our political director's family members actually work in this factory. And then there was also Maduri Farms, where my mother works, that also had a big outbreak. And one man died from that man being El Señor Gonzalez, who actually happened to be the father of my dear, dear friend, who was a varsity soccer teammate of mine back in Salem. And we're hearing stories like this every single day, but I think that one important thing to understand is that the effects have been magnified on our communities. People do not have access to some of the most basic things that we all really take for granted, I think, like unemployment insurance, like healthcare, like our immigration status. And what I keep telling people is that a lot of the things that are happening right now, especially people falling through the cracks of not having access to the federal stimulus when they need to be able to make ends meet for their families, is that we still need immigration reform, right? Legalization with a pathway to citizenship. Without this second class that has been created in our system that makes people easily exploitable, easily taken advantage of, and easily falling through the cracks will not get fixed. I mean, racism still exists, right? But this is a huge thing that we have been fighting for since our inception. We were able to get it in 1985 and 86 through the amnesty. My family was actually direct beneficiaries of that amnesty. We haven't seen anything since. We had a chance in 2013. Congress and the Senate blew it on the federal level, and now we're where we're at today. Recessions, pandemics later, many people getting deported, all of that. And just to kind of circle back just on the stats that I shared earlier, in case you missed it, here's just a very basic slide of what the landscape is on our agricultural labor here in Oregon. 87,000 farm workers, 40% speaking Indigenous languages exclusively, and then 70%, almost. I said 50 to 60 earlier, but this particular stat was from the Bureau of Labor and Industries. So these conditions have really made it very common for our agricultural workers to experience these things. I think that with COVID-19, like I said, it's just getting magnified, but already, even before the pandemic, we were experiencing very high rates of sexual violence in the fields. These are some of our bread and butter issues at PCUN, or main organizing issues, wage theft of workers and discrimination. But also during COVID-19, I think that what's really been magnified is that we have been needing to make sure that the working conditions are safe, that people have access to wraparound services, that people have access to direct cash relief, things like that. And so we have been noticing that even after several things have been put into place for our workers, that, even labor contractors and employers are still not following the COVID-19 temporary rules that OSHA put out at the beginning of June, and still hearing about folks not providing proper PPE, and that people are being put in unsafe conditions that put people at risk. So what we've been doing specifically to try to elevate and really bring awareness around the conditions for workers is, well, one, thanks to some of the advocacy that was done at the state level, we were able to enact temporary rules through OSHA for the remainder of the harvest, but that's only until the end of October. Clock is ticking on that. But right now we do have protections that revolve around sanitation, having very clear guidance around social distancing, PPE being provided, more hand washing stations, just having access to water on the labor camps, making sure that people can wash their hands, and making sure that there's more washing stations and toilets. Believe it or not, that's what we're still fighting right now, ratio wise to the amount of workers that are out there in the transportation. Also having very strong standards around making sure that everything gets disinfected after workers are in the transportation, and that they're also being provided with PPE. And then in the labor housing, which has been it's always an uphill battle with the labor housing. We got bunk beds banned for the remainder of the temporary rule, as well as also having more access to water stations and some other basic needs that people will need to protect themselves during the pandemic. We've also been working with the Oregon governor to mobilize resources and logistics, housing, financial relief for workers in order for them to be set up to succeed. And there was a $30 million package that was released at the beginning of June, end of June, that really focuses on that, and continue to advocate for farm workers and BIPOC communities to be included in the federal stimulus, because people are still needing it, despite, a lot of people got left out. And there was something called the HEROES Act that passed through the Senate or the House, but no action has been done on the Senate side. Also, one thing that we're really proud of is the Oregon Worker Relief Fund. This is an innovative program. Some of you may have already given to it. $25 million have already been dispersed to undocumented workers who have been affected by COVID. And this has really been a program that we were able to build from the ground up. 100 community-based organizations stepped up to do advocacy to try to get a state allocation, private dollars, and foundation dollars mixed together so that we can provide financial emergency relief to undocumented workers, farm workers, all kinds of workers really in the food supply chain, and low-wage immigrant workers who have been totally forgotten by the federal government and who have been left behind by the unemployment insurance, even though a lot of people got laid off during those really intense weeks of shelter in place. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I will have a fishbowl Q&A.